The invoice arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded once inside a plain envelope, and the factory manager set it on his desk without opening it for most of an hour. When he finally read it, he understood that the number at the bottom represented something more than money. It represented the cost of doing nothing with what the machines left behind. The figure was not catastrophic. It was, in the precise language of spreadsheets, a line item. But it was a line item that had grown quietly every quarter like a weed in a field that no one had been hired to watch. The cost was for disposal, for removal, for the measured, contracted hauling away of the thin strips and narrow offcuts that the CNC equipment produced as a matter of physics every time a blade met a board. The factory made precision parts. The factory also inevitably made waste. And the waste, it turned out, had been costing them nearly as much to remove as it cost to produce in the first place. The manager placed the invoice in a folder. The folder went into a drawer. The drawer stayed closed for 3 weeks. When it opened again, it was because someone had finally asked a question no one had thought to ask before. Not who would take the waste away, but whether anyone might want it. Precision Prefab occupied a building that had been, in a previous life, a grain storage facility. The rafters were original. The concrete floor had been poured and re-poured so many times that its history had become geological. But everything inside the building now moved with the certainty of automation. The machines knew their tolerances. The sensors knew the tolerances of the machines. The inventory software knew the output of the sensors, and it reported this information to 3 separate terminals that no single person ever needed to look at simultaneously. The factory was, by the standards of its industry, a well-run operation. It produced components that fit together with a precision that older craftsmen, working from memory and feel, had never been asked to achieve. The material that entered the building was graded hardwood, oak, ash, hard maple when the contracts demanded it. It arrived on pallets, stickered in the traditional way. Each row of boards is separated from the one above it by thin wooden spacers that allowed the air to move through the stack and the moisture to leave the wood at a pace the wood could tolerate without cracking. This was not innovation. This was a practice as old as the lumber trade itself. What the machines could not use, they left behind in the bins that lined the eastern wall of the factory floor. The bins were organized by species. The material in them was not garbage. It was simply not what the machines had been programmed to produce. The strips were too narrow for the automated equipment to hold without risk. The end pieces were too short to run through the profiler. They were, by the logic of the factory, residual. Arthur Hemlock did not work in the factory. He worked outside it, in the space between the loading dock and the tree line, where the factory had assigned him a covered area to receive and sort incoming material. He was the only person in the operation who performed his work entirely by hand. He had been doing so for longer than most of the machinery had existed. He worked slowly, and he worked without conversation, and he worked in a way that suggested he had decided at some point in his life that hurry was a form of waste more costly than any invoice. Arthur had noticed the bins in the way that a man with decades of attention to material notices everything that accumulates near him. He had said nothing for a long time because no one had asked him anything, and Arthur Hemlock was not a man who offered observations to rooms that were not listening. The listening began on an afternoon in early spring when a junior operations coordinator named Rebecca Solis was walking the eastern wall with a clipboard, updating a disposal schedule that had grown so routine as to be nearly invisible. She had been assigned the task because someone senior had found it beneath them, and she had accepted the task because she was still in the stage of her career where acceptance felt like strategy. She stopped beside one of the bins and looked into it for longer than the clipboard required. The material inside was ash. The strips were thin but clean, kiln-dried to a moisture content that the factory had paid to achieve and then paid again to remove. She picked one up. It was tight-grained, with the kind of pale, consistent figure that some of the higher-end furniture makers across the region would have been glad to work with. She wrote something in the margin of her clipboard that was not part of the disposal schedule. That evening, she asked a question of the production foreman, Jerry Tolan, who had been with Precision Prefab long enough to remember when the bins had first appeared and long enough after that to have stopped seeing them. He told her the bins were a cost. She told him they might be the opposite. He looked at her clipboard for a while. He asked her if she had spoken to Arthur. She had not. The next morning, she did. Arthur listened to her describe the proposal without moving from the position he had adopted at the beginning of her explanation, which was seated on an upturned pallet, both hands resting on his knees. When she finished, he looked at her for a moment. Then he said that the material in the bins was not waste. She said she understood that now. He said it was not worth nothing, but it was also not worth what they might assume it was worth because its value was entirely conditional on how it was handled from this point forward. She said she understood that too. He said the stacking had to be right, the stickering had to give the air a path through the pile, and the sorting had to keep the species clean and the grades honest because mixed material sold for the price of the worst piece in the bundle, and there was no point producing anything for a price like that. She wrote this down. He said he could take the material if the factory would let him take it at the end of each week, and he would sort it and handle it in the way it needed to be handled, and he would not pay them for the privilege because the labor involved in making it usable was not trivial, but neither would they need to pay for its removal. She said that was a fair arrangement. Jerry Tolan, who had been standing to the side of this conversation with his arms folded and an expression that suggested he was running calculations, said that the cost savings on the disposal contract alone would justify the arrangement, and that as far as he was concerned the agreement could begin the following week. The corporate office, which was in another state, was not consulted. This was either an oversight or a judgment call, depending on who would later be asked to characterize it. Arthur arrived on Friday afternoons in a truck that was older than the agreement and showed more weather than both of them combined. He backed it to the loading dock with the practiced care of someone who has performed a physical task enough times that the body does it while the mind attends to something else. He lowered the tailgate. He moved to the bins. He did not rush. Rushing with material like this was how you broke the corners, how you let a clean piece develop a ding along its face, how you lost the value of something that had no value left to lose without your attention to it. He loaded the truck in a specific order. The longest pieces went to the bottom, aligned with the truck bed. The shorter pieces came next, arranged so that the weight above them was distributed and not concentrated. He brought his own stickers, thin strips of dried softwood that he cut himself, kept in a bundle behind the seat, consistent in their dimensions in the way that matters when you are stacking material that will sit for any length of time. He drove home on roads that cut through land he had once farmed. He had grown up on that land, worked it through the kind of years that require belief, and then been removed from it by the machinery of debt during a period when that machinery had been particularly efficient. He had watched the auction from the edge of the property, and then he had not returned for a long time. The offcuts went into a structure on the property he had come back to, which was not the original farm, but was near enough to it that he could see the old place from certain angles of certain seasons. He had built the structure himself, over the course of a winter, from material that had taught him what it needed. It was neither elaborate nor provisional. It was the kind of building that knows what it is. What Arthur did with the material was not a system in the way that systems are described in operations manuals. It was closer to a habit, in the sense that habits contain within them a deep and tested logic that their practitioners no longer need to explain because the explanation has been absorbed into the action itself. He sorted by species first, always, before anything else, because a piece of ash that joins a pile of oak will eventually cause someone, somewhere, a problem they did not plan for. He sorted by length within each species, not by measuring, but by handling, because a man who has handled enough boards knows their length by the weight and balance of them in the air without needing a tape to confirm it. He graded by face. He set the clear pieces apart from the pieces with character. He never called them defects, because the word implied a failure, and the figure in a board was not a failure. It was a history, and there was a market for history if you presented it honestly. The stickering was a 1/4 inch of softwood per layer, consistent, aligned vertically from layer to layer so that the load traveled straight down through the pile and did not bow the pieces under it. He left the stack open on all sides. He covered the top against rain and left the rest to the air. He kept records in a notebook. Species, grade, approximate count, date of receipt. Nothing more. The notebook was not a database. It was a record of attention. The shed filled slowly, and then, over the course of months, it filled faster. And Arthur noted this in the way he noted most things, without comment, and with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has learned to take his evidence from what is actually in front of him. The shed had been built for one purpose. By the end of the second year of the arrangement, it held enough material to have required a purpose of its own. He added a second lean-to along the north wall of the original structure, open-sided, with a roof pitch calculated to throw rain away from the stacks and not into them. He added a third covered area beside it, smaller, reserved for the material that required more time before it was ready. Pieces that had come in with moisture content still slightly elevated, that needed another season before they would hold a joint without creeping. The barn that now occupied the property would not have been recognized as a barn by anyone arriving with a conventional definition of the word. It was not for animals. It held no machinery. It contained, organized with the kind of care that suggests not obsession, but simply respect for what things are worth, a depth of usable hardwood that would have taken a retail lumber supplier years to assemble from conventional purchasing channels. He had paid nothing for any of it except his labor. He had paid, in his labor, more than most people would have been willing to give. This was the nature of the arrangement, and it was the nature of Arthur Hemlock, and neither of these things struck him as remarkable, because remarkable was a word that required comparison, and Arthur had long since stopped comparing himself to anyone who was not present. His name was Mark Jennings, and he arrived on a Wednesday with a portfolio that contained, among other documents, a report he had commissioned and a mandate he had been given, and both of these things told him, in a language of margins and optimization ratios, that the eastern region of precision prefab supply operations needed attention. Jennings was not a dishonest man. He was precise in the way that the factory's machines were precise, calibrated to specific tolerances, reliable within them, and genuinely not designed for anything outside them. He had been hired, at the level of the company at which such hirings take place, to identify inefficiencies. He had identified many, and the correction of many had made the company money, and this had made him a figure of quiet influence at a certain kind of corporate meeting. He did not know anything about hardwood. He did not need to know anything about hardwood for the kind of work he did, which was about ratios and precedents and the demonstrable movement of resources from one column of a ledger to another. He looked at things, and he saw the same thing each time: potential on one side, liability on the other, and the space between them is the territory he was paid across. The arrangement with Arthur Hemlock had not been documented in the way that a corporate optimizer expected arrangements to be documented. There was no formal contract in the system. There was a handshake in Jerry Tolan's memory and a disposal cost line on the ledger that had simply, without explanation that the system recognized, ceased to appear. Jennings asked Tolan about this. Tolan explained the arrangement. Jennings listened with the expression of someone who is listening closely in order to identify the category of problem they're dealing with before deciding which response is appropriate. The report Jennings produced was measured in its language and direct in its conclusions. The disposal arrangement had not been authorized at the appropriate level of the organization. The material leaving the facility each week represented a quantity of hardwood that, valued at market rates, constituted an asset that was currently being transferred off the books for zero consideration. There was, the report noted in a section that had been formatted with particular emphasis, a significant inventory of processed material being held on private property with no formal agreement governing its disposition, no insurance mechanism connecting it to the company, and no means by which the company could recover the value of that material if the arrangement were found, upon legal review, to constitute an informal sale rather than an informal donation. The company's legal department, copied on the report, responded within 2 business days. Their response used the phrase material in question in a way that had been selected, Arthur's neighbor who had read it later noted, specifically to avoid calling it his. Jerry Tolan was called into a meeting. He emerged from it looking like a man who had been asked to describe a landscape he loved to people who had been assigned to pave it. Arthur received a letter. The letter was polite. It used formal address in complete sentences and expressed, in a tone that had been reviewed by counsel, the company's interest in clarifying the ongoing arrangement regarding facility residuals. Arthur read the letter once, set on the kitchen table, and went out to the barn to finish sorting a stack of white ash that had arrived the previous Friday and still needed to be graded on its second face. The confrontation, when it came, happened in Arthur's workshop. Jennings had requested the meeting. He had arrived with a colleague who took notes. Arthur had cleared a section of the work table for them to stand beside, which was the closest the workshop had to a conference arrangement, and Jennings had not remarked on it, which was, Arthur later said, one of the more courteous things the man had managed. Jennings presented two options. The first was a formal licensing arrangement under which Arthur would pay a fee calculated against the appraised market value of the material he received each week, in exchange for continued access to the facility's residual output. The second was the cessation of the arrangement, with a formal inventory of the material currently held on the property and a negotiated settlement regarding its disposition. Arthur listened to both options completely. Then he said that the material in his barn was his. He said he had received it in exchange for labor and for the removal of a disposal cost that the company had been paying, and that the material's value at that point of transfer had been zero to the company, because the company had been paying to make it go away, and the thing he had received in exchange for making it go away was the material itself. He said he would not pay for it twice. Jennings said that the company's position was that the arrangement had not been formally authorized and therefore could not be considered binding. Arthur said that the arrangement had been entered into in good faith by both parties, witnessed by multiple employees, and documented in the company's own records as a cessation of disposal costs, and that he would be happy to continue the conversation with the attorneys rather than the optimizer. The colleague's note-taking stopped. Jennings said that the company reserved the right to pursue the matter through formal channels. Arthur said that was entirely the company's option. He walked them to their car. The formal channels took time. While the formal channels were operating, Arthur continued sorting. He could not, by the terms of a preliminary agreement reached between lawyers representing both parties, take new material from the factory. But neither had anyone established, in writing, that he was required to stop working with what he already had. He built an indoor space that winter, an enclosed section of the barn with a small wood stove and a set of hand tools and a joiner and planer combination unit he had bought used from a millwright outside the county who was retiring and preferred to see the equipment go somewhere it would be worked rather than stored. He began processing the material himself. He cut it to dimension. He jointed the faces. He stacked the processed pieces in a separate section of the barn, stickered in the traditional way, and he marked each bundle with its species and grade and dimension in the same handwriting that had kept the original notebook. He was no longer a man holding offcuts. He was a man with a furniture mill. It was not large. It did not need to be large. It needed to be capable, and it was because Arthur Hemlock understood that capability was not about size. It was about knowing what you were doing and doing it until the material in front of you became what it was supposed to be. The barn inventory, when it was formally assessed by an independent appraiser during the legal process, was valued at a figure that caused a brief but notable silence in the offices of the company's legal department. The settlement was reached without a trial. The legal detail of it is less instructive than its outcome, which was this. Arthur retained full title to the material in the barn, the processed inventory in the enclosed mill space, and the equipment he had acquired during the period of the arrangement. The company received a formal acknowledgement that the arrangement had concluded and a modest payment that covered the administrative cost of the legal process without constituting any admission regarding the original terms. Jerry Tolan, who had been asked to provide a sworn account of the original arrangement, provided one that was accurate and complete and cost him nothing professionally, because by the time it was requested, Jennings's division of the company had been reorganized in a way that removed him from his direct oversight of the region. Rebecca Solis had by then moved to a different role at a different company, where she had been hired in part for the quality of a case study she had included in her professional portfolio, a case study that described, without using the names of the parties involved, a disposal-to-resource conversion that had generated significant value for material that had been classified as a liability. She had declined to specify, in the case study, whether the company that had generated the material had kept any of that value. The grandson's name was David, and he came to the property during a school break in a way that young people sometimes arrive at the edges of a complicated family story, not fully knowing the shape of it, but curious in the way that people are when they suspect that something worth understanding has been happening nearby for longer than they have been paying attention. He was studying design. He had the vocabulary of design school and the habits of someone who had spent several years being told that concepts were as valuable as execution, which is a thing that design schools sometimes teach and that workshops tend to eventually correct. He spent a morning watching Arthur work. He did not ask many questions in that first morning, which Arthur regarded as a sign of intelligence, because the questions a person asks before they have watched for a while are usually the wrong questions. By the afternoon, he was helping. By the end of the week, he had begun to understand the sorting logic, not as a system, but as a reasoning. The reasoning of someone who has learned that every category of material has its appropriate use, and that the failure to identify that use is a failure of thinking rather than a failure of the material. He came back the following break. He came back the break after that. By the time he graduated, the partnership had a name, though Arthur had resisted naming it for longer than David thought necessary. The name described what they did, which was to take material that had been identified by someone else as having no further use and to find, through attention and skill, what that material actually was. They sold to furniture makers, to architectural millwork shops, to a small number of individual craftspeople who had learned, through channels that word of mouth creates, that the material available from the hemlock operation was consistently what it was represented to be, sorted and graded honestly, and priced in a way that reflected its actual value. Arthur Hemlock was not a philosopher. He did not offer the experience of the previous years as a lesson or as evidence of anything beyond what it visibly was. But he said one thing to David once in the late afternoon when the light in the barn had gone the color of the ash he was handling, and David had asked him how he had known at the beginning that the material was worth the trouble. Arthur set down the board he was holding. He said that waste was not a property of material. Waste was a conclusion, and like most conclusions, it told you more about the person who reached it than about the thing it was applied to. A machine that could not use a narrow strip of ash had reached a conclusion about that strip of ash. The conclusion was accurate within the machine's tolerances. It said nothing about the strip. He said that every piece of material he had ever worked with had been asking the same question the whole time, which was whether there was anyone in the room who knew what to do with it. He picked the board back up and ran his thumb along the grain. He said that most of the time, there was someone. You just had to be patient enough to find them, or to become them, which were, in his experience, often the same thing. The barn is still there. The mill inside it runs 4 days a week now. The fifth is for sorting, which Arthur still does himself in the mornings, by hand, in the way he has always done it. The farm he left during the crisis of that earlier decade, the land that was sold at auction while he watched from the road, came back to him in the way that things sometimes come back when patience is long enough and circumstances move in the right direction. He paid less for it than the debt that had originally taken it. He had found the notice of sale in a county listing and had attended the auction and had made his bid without drama. And the land had transferred in the manner that land transfers when the paperwork is complete. He does not farm it. He lets most of it return to what it was before anyone farmed it, which is a kind of patience with the land that the land itself seems to appreciate, if land could be said to appreciate anything. If this kind of story holds something for you, if the logic of Arthur Hemlock's reasoning or the patience of his practice speaks to the way you think about material, about work, about what gets overlooked and why, then the subscription button is below. New stories arrive when they are ready, not before. That is the only schedule we have ever kept.